Hey crystal lover, Ashley here from the Love and Light School of Crystal Therapy. And I'm so excited because in this video I'm going to kick off a series all about teaching you how to identify your stones even when they all look the same. So if you have a rough or raw or natural crystal, it's a lot easier to identify that stone because you can look at things like the crystal system and structure and shape. But when you have a tumbled stone, it's really hard to tell what that stone is just by looking at it. So the best way to do this to start out with is just by looking at the color of your crystal. So by looking at if you have a red stone or a violet stone or a blue stone, you can really narrow down and eliminate lots of options when it comes to identification. But let's say that you have a red stone. Now you've eliminated tons of options, but there are still so many different things that this red crystal could be. So the next step to your identification would be to actually look at, some of the crystals that aren't commonly found tumbled and eliminating those as well. So let's go ahead and start out with our group of red and pink crystals in today's video. So if you have a red tumbled stone, chances are it's not going to be something like vanadinite or chrosoite, cinnabar, zircon, spinel, or even cuprite, because these are not stones that are commonly tumbled into little tumbled stones. They're not really commercially available that way. Now, for some of these crystals, it's because they're really toxic and it's hard to polish or tumble them. For others, it's just that they form very small crystals, so it wouldn't be worth taking a really valuable small stone and polishing it up. So you can eliminate some of those really high value stones most of the time right off the bat. So that leaves you with some of the more commercially available red stones like red jasper and garnet and ruby, maybe even something like red coral. So how do you tell the difference between these stones? Now, at first glance, a lot of your tumbled red stones might look really similar, and it might be difficult to pick out the few characteristics that really separate them from one another. So let's take them stone by stone, and I'll tell you some of the things to look for when it comes to these crystals. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover every crystal in this training series, but I hope to cover some of the most common stones that you might find at a New Age store or rock shop, or even on online sites like eBay, to kind of tell you what to expect. So let's start with the most common tumbled red stone, which is red jasper. Now, jasper is kind of notorious for having tons of different appearances. It might look very different from stone to stone, but jasper is always going to be opaque. Now, there are a couple terms you're going to need to know as I go through these training videos, and opaque is one of them. So opaque stones are stones that you cannot see through at all. They're solid. They have no transparency at all. On the far end of the spectrum opposite that, we have transparent stones. So these are stones you can actually see through, and somewhere in between we have translucent stones. So these have some of the qualities of a transparent stone, but you can't necessarily see through it. Maybe just if you put up a light to the edges, you can see that that light is kind of being absorbed inside of the crystal, but you can't really see through it, but it's not completely solid like an opaque stone either. So those are our three terms we're going to be using to describe that. We have opaque, translucent, and transparent. Those are all a little bit different. So red jasper is an opaque stone. Now it is a form of quartz, believe it or not. It's a cryptocrystalline form of quartz. So rather than having crystal points that you can see with the naked eye, it has tiny, tiny crystals that are found in red jasper's massive state, and we actually can't see these with the naked eye, but they are there. Now, something else interesting to know is that another form of cryptocrystalline quartz is agate. Now, jasper and agate are actually both really the same thing. They're varieties of chalcedony, which is cryptocrystalline quartz. The only difference is that jasper doesn't have any banding to it, neither does chalcedony, and agate has banding. So kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind. Now that's for true jaspers. There are lots of jaspers that are called jasper that aren't actually jasper. It's one of those words that's used like daisy that doesn't quite mean really anything in particular and can be a little bit confusing. But red jasper is an opaque, red stone. Now this red can really range from kind of a muddy brownish red up to a bright vibrant red, or even a little bit more of an orangish red or a burnt orangish red. I've seen red jasper in all of these color variations. Now this can just depend on the concentration of mineral inclusions that are within that jasper, the amount of iron typically that's present within that jasper, but it can also vary a little bit based on its location or locality where it was found. So if you look at different images of red jasper, you'll actually be able to see this subtle variation in color. Now all of these crystals are still red jasper, but they just have subtle variations to their color. Sometimes I get asked things like, is one color stronger than another or more potent? And the answer here is no. It's really just about working with the pieces that you really feel drawn to and attracted to. So red jasper, opaque, ranges in red color, but it almost looks as if the stone were painted, as if the color was painted on. It's usually fairly uniform. A lot of times you'll see only very subtle differences in one stone where the color shifts a little bit darker or lighter. But you can also have variations on this. Now there's something called brecciated jasper or brachiated jasper. People kind of say it both ways. And this is red jasper that has been broken apart into little pieces, little sediment type pieces. It usually settles in a riverbed, and then later a quartz solution comes along and almost like glues those pieces back together in a sedimentary rock. And so here you'll see typically red jasper, sometimes other colors of jasper as well, often yellow, again depending on location, but this will be kind of cemented back together with quartz. So you'll see those little chunks actually held together with veining of quartz or chalcedony, that cryptocrystalline quartz. And so this is something, again, it's based on location, but you'll see this really interesting, it's a conglomerate stone. So you'll actually see those little chips being held together. And this is often something that you see that's red with little kind of veins of a translucent blue, gray, or clear. Now let's talk about some other red stones and how to identify them. So garnet is a really popular red stone. Now this is like a deep black cherry color, and this is actually a translucent to transparent stone depending on the quality. So of course the garnets that you see in jewelry are usually transparent. They're very high quality gem grade stones, but most of our tumbled stones actually aren't that clear, and in fact because they're translucent and the tumbled stone is usually about an inch across in all directions, it's quite large. So although maybe a small piece of that would be transparent if you held a light up to it, because the stone is so thick, it looks really dark, almost black at times. And so you have to just kind of catch your stone in the light, and sometimes on the surface of the stone you'll see a little bit of a red sheen. Or if you hold a bright light like an LED light up to the edge of your stone, you might see that light come through just a little bit, giving it kind of a red or red-brown tinge to that light from the stone. So it's a great way to tell that you have some garnet. Now the other thing that's really interesting about garnet is if you look at the shape of an actual garnet crystal, a lot of the garnet that's commercially available after it's tumbled, they just take the outer edges off of that stone, and you can still actually see a lot of the garnet structure even though it's been kind of smoothed out. So take a look at some rough garnet crystals, and if your tumbled red stone meets those criteria that I talked about in terms of that black cherry color, maybe you can see that hint of red coming through with your flashlight, and then it also takes on the same formation or structure of a garnet crystal, it just looks like it's been smoothed out a little bit, then chances are you definitely have a red pyrope garnet, either from China, or sometimes even you get some great garnet crystals from India, and that character of that crystal shape can come through. So another really interesting thing about a lot of these tumbled garnets that are the really deep reddish, almost black colored garnets is that they'll have a little bit of a chatoyancy or a sheen on their surface. So if you get them in a bright light, you can see sometimes an asterism or almost like a little cat's eye effect on the garnet. And this is something that's really pretty interesting that you don't see with too many other red stones. So it's something to look out for to help you identify your crystal. Now there's also red tiger's eye. Now speaking of that beautiful chatoyancy, red tiger's eye has this cat's eye effect also. Now red tiger's eye is particularly interesting because if you're familiar with golden tiger's eye, it's very similar in appearance, only it's red. And so if you move your stone around in the light and you get this brilliant, almost ripple effect from this chatoyancy, that's actually caused by tiny, tiny little asbestos fibers that are very safe because they're trapped inside a quartz crystal structure, a cryptocrystalline quartz structure. And so you have this beautiful play of color from kind of a deep black, brown, red, all the way to a really vibrant red that just kind of shimmers in the light. And you usually see this in some very parallel bands or stripes, and those just kind of shimmer in the light, but you can really distinctively see those bands or layers in a red tiger's eye stone. Now there's also ruby crystals. So ruby is a form of corundum, and corundum comes in lots of colors: red, yellow, violet, blue, but red corundum is known as ruby. And so the ruby that you see commercially available doesn't look like the high quality ruby jewelry that you're probably used to seeing. So tumbled ruby stones that are commonly available often have kind of a magenta, pink to red color. Now sometimes these can be a little bit muddy brown depending on the quality. Sometimes they're a really bright, vibrant magenta. Those are usually quite a bit more expensive. And sometimes they have a little bit of a chatoyant effect as well, depending on the quality of the stone. But they're very hard, they're very durable, and sometimes you'll see little metallic flecks, especially in the tumbled stones. Now, this is often iron or hematite that was kind of adhered to the surface of the ruby crystal before it was tumbled. And these often kind of just make their way right into that finished product of the tumbled stone. They're not always there, but if you have that, that's a really good identifiable feature. And then looking for that really specific kind of magenta, rosy, ruby color is a good giveaway because there aren't too many tumbled stones that are this color. Another stone that is a little similar in color is Throughlite, but Throughlite has a little bit more of a speckled or mottled appearance to it. Almost like an epidote does, except an epidote is green, a Throughlite is pink. It looks almost like it's made of little granules of pink, vibrant pink sand. It's really interesting, but that's the only stone that you see commonly available tumbled that's in that same kind of color class as a tumbled ruby. Now you can also sometimes get red coral, and this is most often sponge coral that has been dyed to enhance the red color. You see this really commonly, particularly in inexpensive jewelry pieces coming from China and other places in Asia, but you do sometimes see it in tumbled stones as well. Now coral is very lightweight, so if you have a coral, it's usually really vibrant red because, like I said, most of them are artificially dyed. Also very lightweight, and you can actually see the kind of sponginess that coral has, where it gets its name, sponge coral. And it looks like little round openings because the coral is very plant-like, very vascular. So you kind of see that in the stone itself. If you've ever seen a Petoskey stone or a fossilized coral, and you can actually see where all those little branches were, that's a lot what a sponge coral will look like. Now it can also look like tree rings, where if you had a larger piece of coral that was kind of smoothed over on one end in the polishing process, it'll look almost like little tree rings, or often it will radiate out from the center in kind of a starburst-like pattern that fills the whole piece of coral. And this is, again, usually a very vibrant red, or sometimes it looks like a red stone that's almost been faded out in the sun, because not all parts of that coral take on the dye evenly. So sometimes some look a little bit faded. And then there's also petrified wood. Now petrified wood can be red in color, often mixed with some browns and some grays. Petrified wood actually looks a little bit similar to coral because you have oftentimes those little tree rings or that very granular appearance. So think of like what a piece of tree bark often looks like, where it has some real texture to it. A lot of times petrified wood has a very similar appearance in that texture, but it has been replaced with minerals like chalcedonies, jaspers, sometimes even opal, and these pick up trace elements and are bring in different colors like that gray, brown, and red. But you can find, especially from the petrified forest in the American Southwest, you'll see really vibrant red pieces of petrified wood. Now these aren't largely available on the commercial market any longer, but old stock is sometimes sold, and often you will see smaller pieces of petrified wood that are completely red in color. I hope that this has helped you learn a little bit about your red stones. Now I'd like to transition into some of the most common pink stones because I feel like these are kind of still part of this color ray, and sometimes the pink and the red overlap a little bit like in the ruby and Throughlite stones. But I thought that we could transition into some of these pink stones, and I'll give you some identifiers for how to tell these apart. Now first I want to talk about rhodonite and rhodochrosite, and I want to talk about these two together because so many people get these mixed up. Now rhodonite and rhodochrosite are very different stones. Rhodonite is pink with black veins or sometimes with mottled brown throughout. Rhodochrosite is pink, often with a lacy white banding. The most beautiful, most high quality rhodochrosite has very clear lacy white banding in its crystal structure. But not all rhodochrosite displays that. Some really high quality pieces of rhodochrosite are bright, vibrant, gemmy pink and don't show any of that white lacy banding. And some pieces of rhodonite, particularly those from China and other places in Asia, often don't show the black veining. That's really common more for African rhodonite. So sometimes it's really helpful to know the locality or location where your stone came from to help you look at some of these identifying characteristics. But in general, if your rhodonite has, or if your pink stone has the darker veining, it's rhodonite, and you can remember that because nighttime is dark, so rhodonite has the dark color, and rhodochrosite just sounds like kind of a lacy, frilly word to say, and it has that beautiful lacy kind of scalloped white banding in it. I love both of these stones. I think they're excellent companion crystals. They work very well together, but don't get them mixed up. It can be really tricky because their names are very similar. Now there's also pink opal. Now pink opal is often confused for pink calcite, believe it or not. But pink opal is a little bit lighter weight than pink calcite. They have a very similar color. They're kind of a milky, creamy pink. Now pink manganocalcite often has some beautiful banding in it. Now it's not quite the same banding that you would see in a rhodochrosite. It's much more subtle. It's almost like when you dye an Easter egg and you get different layers of color. It's like that, except it's just slightly darker and slightly whiter shades of the same hue of pink. So it's really an interesting stone, and sometimes those bands are barely visible and sometimes they're really clear. It just depends on the quality of your stone and the individual piece and the size of that crystal. But it's a little bit heavier than pink opal. Pink opal is a little bit more translucent. Pink calcite is opaque. The pink opal can be translucent, and pink opal even sometimes has little dendrites in it. Now these are manganese dendrites. They look like little tree roots growing through the stone, and they're not present in every piece of pink opal, but if you have those little dendrites, chances are that's the stone that you've got. Now there's also, of course, rose quartz, one of the most commonly available pink stones on the market, and this is a transparent to translucent stone. Rose quartz is not opaque, but it is often very translucent. It will be almost opaque, but if you shine a bright light, you can still kind of see the stone light up a little bit. Now some really high quality rose quartz, especially from somewhere like Madagascar, is often even transparent and you can see right through it. These pieces often have a little bit of an asterism or a star effect if you get them in a bright light, they're particularly desirable, normally a little bit pricier than a regular rose quartz from, say, Brazil or somewhere like that, but they're all very beautiful. Now, there's a really deep pink, almost lavender color of rose quartz that is really highly coveted and comes from the Black Hills in the United States, from South Dakota. It's an amazing color of stone, and it's almost a pinkish lavender. Some of it's also just a very bright kind of rosy pink. But this stone comes in a lot of different little variations of shade depending on its location, but it has that very quartzy appearance to it. And I wish I knew a better way to describe that, but it's just that translucent kind of appearance, sometimes with some milky banding through it. You'll often see that, especially in lower grade rose quartz. And finally, that brings me to pink tourmaline. So this is one that is not quite as commonly available. When you do see it, it's usually a little bit more expensive, but it often gets confused for things like ruby, in particular, if it's not very transparent. So some pink tourmaline is really transparent, really see-through. That's usually a little easier to identify. Typically, those pieces that you see come from Brazil. Most of what's available on the market there coming from Brazil. Some pieces also coming from Africa, really high quality bubblegum pink pieces coming from California and the United States, but you don't often see many of those tumbled. So this stone, like I said, can be transparent. It's going to be a little bit more expensive when it's transparent, but when it's just translucent, a little bit more milky, pretty cloudy, it still has this beautiful kind of bubblegum pink color to kind of a medium pink color. And you can sometimes, even after the stone has been polished, see the striations in that more opaque variety. So those lines that run through the stone, you can often see. So that is a wrap for our very first video on giving you some tips for identifying your most common red and pink crystals. I'll be back with you tomorrow to talk about how to identify your orange stones. And until then, I'm Ashley Levy of the Love and Light School of Crystal Therapy. Crystal blessings.